Welcome to the Deep Dive. It is the evening of Tuesday, March 10th, 2026. And if you're listening to this right now, chances are you had a pretty rough awakening at the gas pump today.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
Right. You might have stared at the dial ticking past $6, $7, maybe even $8 a gallon, depending on where you live. Or perhaps you've been doom scrolling through those increasingly alarming headlines about the Middle East, watching the notifications light up your phone.
And you're probably wondering how a conflict playing out halfway across the world is suddenly dictating your daily life.
Exactly. Draining your wallet, shaking the foundations of global stability.
It's the inescapable reality of the moment. I mean, we are watching a localized geopolitical earthquake send these massive tidal waves across the entire interconnected global system. And the speed at which it's happening, it's catching a lot of people entirely off guard.
Which is exactly why we're here. Our mission today is to cut through this incredibly thick fog of war. To do that, we have gathered a massive stack of the latest geopolitical analysis, military assessments, and intelligence reports.
Right, specifically combing through dozens of hours of interviews and raw video analysis.
Yeah, all uploaded over the last 48 hours, featuring some of the world's top military minds and regional analysts. We're going to distill that raw data to give you a comprehensive, unvarnished picture. But before we get into those heavy details, let's establish the ground rules for how we are tackling this today.
A crucial step, really, because the information environment out there is highly volatile right now.
Extremely.
The sources we've reviewed feature highly opinionated experts. Passions are running hot naturally, and the commentary often bleeds into some heavy political bias.
We are stripping all of that away. We won't be naming these individual commentators, nor are we taking any political sides.
Yeah.
If we discuss politically charged content, whether it leans left or right, please understand we are simply reporting on the ideas contained in the original source material.
We are not endorsing any viewpoints.
Right. Our sole objective is analytical. We are here to break down the facts, the raw data, and the strategic realities of the United States and Israel's war on Iran, which is now entering its 11th and, well, as we cross midnight tonight, its 12th day.
And what becomes immediately apparent when you aggregate all this data is the massive delta between the initial political promises of this conflict and the stark, grinding reality currently unfolding on the battlefield.
Let's start right there. The outbreak of the conflict and the immediate reality check that followed. The spark that ignited this entire powder keg was the assassination of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
Yes.
And almost immediately, the Iranian system elected his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new Supreme Leader. But what I found really jarring in the analysis was the reaction from Western leaders.
The expectations versus reality.
Exactly. U.S. President Donald Trump went on camera to demand unconditional surrender and claimed that this new Iranian leader wouldn't last a week without U.S. approval. Help me understand the disconnect there, because it seems like Washington expected the entire Iranian government to just, fold overnight.
It reflects a fundamental historical misunderstanding of Iranian resolve, and specifically their institutional structure. The analysts in the military videos we watched pointed out that treating the succession of the supreme leader as something that requires external validation, it's entirely detached from how the Iranian political and religious establishment actually operates.
So it's not just a single dictator at the top holding the entire house of cards together.
Not at all. Iran is not a fragile one-man autocracy that collapses when the figurehead is removed. It's a deeply entrenched, multi-layered system. You have the assembly of experts, the Guardian Council, and most importantly, the vast apparatus of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Right, the IRGC.
This system was designed over decades, specifically to ensure the continuity of government during a crisis, particularly a decapitation strike. So when Western leaders talk about this being a short, surgical operation to topple a regime, they're completely misreading the fundamental architecture of the state they are fighting.
Which leads directly into the core of why diplomacy hasn't even gotten off the ground yet. In the footage we reviewed, Iranian officials are openly referring to this not as a border dispute or a skirmish over a specific policy, but as an existential fight for their survival.
Yes.
They keep using the phrase Greater Israel agenda. What does that mean in the context of their refusal to negotiate?
To understand their refusal to negotiate, you really have to look at the psychology of existential warfare. In the Iranian strategic mindset, they believe that the ultimate goal of the U.S. and Israel is their complete extermination, or at the very least, absolute subjugation as a sovereign state.
And when a nation operates under that belief, Standard diplomacy just evaporates.
Exactly. Ceasefires are no longer viewed as humanitarian steps toward peace.
They just see them as a trick.
They view any pause in fighting merely as a tactical breather for the enemy to reload, rearm, and reposition their forces for the next crippling strike.
Wow.
Iran's strategy, according to the military assessments we've synthesized, is remarkably simple in its brutal logic. Survive the initial onslaught, absorb the kinetic strikes, and inflict enough sustained, unendurable pain to force a Western withdrawal.
So they aren't trying to, quote-unquote, win in the traditional sense.
No, they're not trying to conquer Washington or march on Tel Aviv. They simply need to make the financial, political, and human cost of continuing the war too high for the West to bear.
And the human cost is already crossing some horrifying thresholds. We need to talk about the tragedy and the intense information war surrounding it. On the very first day of this conflict, there was a devastating bombing of a girls' elementary school in southern Iran.
An absolute nightmare.
The reports indicate that roughly 175 people, mostly young schoolgirls, were killed. The immediate aftermath of that event seems to be a case study in modern wartime propaganda.
It is. It perfectly illustrates the secondary war being fought alongside the missiles and drones, the war for public perception. The narratives surrounding that bombing are entirely conflicting, and both sides are heavily using it to galvanize their populations.
I watched the press conferences. The U.S. administration came out immediately and blamed Iran. President Trump and his defense officials claimed it was an errant Iranian missile, suggesting that Iran's munitions are so faulty they ended up striking their own people.
What was the official line?
But then, the independent researchers and open-source intelligence analysts in the videos we sourced pointed to something completely different. They analyzed the smartphone footage captured moments before the impact.
Right, and what they found contradicts the official Washington narrative. When you freeze the frame on the incoming munition in those civilian videos, several weapons experts noted that it clearly shows the distinct aerodynamic silhouette of a Western weapon.
Specifically, they identified it as matching the profile of a Tomahawk cruise missile, not a domestic Iranian ballistic missile. How does the average person even begin to sift through that? You have the Pentagon saying one thing, and independent experts pointing to video evidence showing another.
It raises an incredibly difficult question about truth in the digital age during wartime. We're seeing unprecedented levels of censorship being utilized by all sides to control the narrative.
Yeah, the analysts brought up Israel specifically on that front.
Right. In Israel, the government has implemented draconian measures regarding information sharing. Citizens face severe penalties, up to 5 years in prison, according to some of the legal analysts we tracked, simply for sharing smartphone footage of military bases that have been successfully hit by Iranian strikes.
5 years in prison just for uploading a video to social media.
Yes. The strategic goal there is to project total strength and invulnerability. If the domestic population or the international community sees that the Iron Dome or David's Sling air defense systems are being penetrated, it shatters the aura of security.
But in an era where everyone has a high-definition camera in their pocket and commercial satellite imagery is widely available,
cracks in that narrative inevitably appear. The absolute truth about the school bombing or the effectiveness of the strikes may take years of historical forensics to fully uncover. But it serves as a grim reminder that in modern warfare, controlling the story is treated as a critical military objective.
I want to pivot from the information war to the actual physical attrition on the battlefield, because the numbers we are pulling from these defense analysts are staggering. We're looking at a classic David and Goliath asymmetry, but the mechanics of it are incredibly dangerous for the side playing Goliath.
You're referring to what military economists call the economics of interception.
Yes. The financial burn rate of this war seems completely unsustainable. I saw one estimate across multiple defense channels stating that the U.S. is burning through $1 billion to $2 billion a day.
A day.
Just let that sink in for a second. Up to $2 billion every single 24 hours. Where's all that money actually going?
Let's break down the math of this asymmetric warfare because it dictates everything else that happens. Iran has spent the last 2 decades building a massive, decentralized arsenal of loitering munitions.
What we commonly call suicide drones.
Exactly. Drones and relatively inexpensive ballistic missiles. We are talking about drones like the Shahed series that cost anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 to manufacture.
Which is essentially the price of a mid-size sedan. They are building flying cars filled with explosives.
It's a very apt comparison. They are utilizing commercial, off-the-shelf technology, simple engines, and basic GPS guidance. They are cheap and they are plentiful. Now, to shoot down that flying sedan, the United States and Israel cannot rely on cheap technology.
They're using the high-end stuff.
They are forced to utilize highly sophisticated, incredibly complex air defense systems. We are talking about the Patriot missile batteries and the THAAD system.
I've heard the acronym THAAD constantly over the last 12 days. What makes it so special? And more importantly, why is it so expensive?
THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It is a marvel of aerospace engineering. Unlike a traditional missile that uses an explosive warhead to destroy a target with shrapnel, a THAAD interceptor uses what's called kinetic kill technology.
What does kinetic kill actually mean in practice?
Think of it as a sniper firing a bullet to hit another bullet. While both are traveling at hypersonic speeds in the exosphere, the very edge of space.
That's insane.
It relies entirely on the kinetic energy of a direct physical impact to obliterate the incoming ballistic missile. Achieving that level of pinpoint precision requires extraordinarily advanced radar, supercomputing capabilities, and exotic materials.
So it's not cheap.
Not at all. That is why a single THAAD interceptor or a high-end Patriot PAC-3 missile costs anywhere from $3 million to $13 million.
I'm trying to do the math in my head here. You were firing a $13 million interceptor to destroy a $30,000 target.
Yes.
That is an economic black hole.
It is, and it actually gets worse when you factor in military doctrine. A defense commander isn't going to fire just one interceptor at an incoming ballistic missile that might be headed for a populated area or a critical airbase.
They double tap.
Standard operating procedure often requires firing 2, sometimes 3 interceptors at a single target to guarantee its destruction. So, an incoming swarm of 20 relatively cheap Iranian drones and missiles can force a defensive response that costs hundreds of millions of dollars in a matter of minutes.
So you could theoretically win every single tactical engagement in the sky, shoot down 99% of everything they throw at you, and still lose the broader war because you've bankrupted your military reserve.
Precisely. And speaking of reserves, the physical arsenals are depleting at a rate that has defense logistics officers panicking. The reports we sourced indicate that in just the first 3 days of this conflict, up to 800 Patriot missiles were fired by U.S. and allied forces.
800 missiles in a weekend. How does that compare to what we actually have sitting in warehouses?
To put that into context, that 3-day usage represents roughly 30% of the entire annual United States production of Patriot missiles.
30% of a year's production. Gone in 3 days.
One long weekend of heavy fighting consumed a third of a year's worth of manufacturing output.
Why can't the defense contractors just spin up the assembly lines and work overtime? I mean, we did it in World War II with tanks and planes.
Because building a microchip-laden, hyper-precise interceptor is not like stamping out steel for a Sherman tank. Defense contractors have explicitly stated in these interviews that ramping up production takes years, not weeks.
Why years?
You have to source rare earth minerals from vulnerable global supply chains. You have to build incredibly complex new manufacturing lines in cleanroom environments. And most importantly, you have to train highly specialized personnel to build and test them. You cannot just flip a switch and print million-dollar missiles.
Which means the U.S. is running out of bullets for its shield.
They are reportedly scraping the bottom of the barrel right now. The intelligence assessments suggest the Pentagon is frantically pulling interceptors from strategic reserves globally.
Right, I saw they were pulling from Asia.
Yes, they are taking defense systems away from allies like South Korea, a country that faces its own severe tensions with a nuclear-armed North Korea, just to plug the gaps in the Middle East. This creates massive strategic vulnerabilities in other theaters of operation.
I was looking at the target list that analysts were discussing, and it seems Iran is very aware of this vulnerability. They aren't just firing blindly into the desert to drain the bank accounts. They are systematically going after radar installations and air defense arrays. Is there a specific tactical reason for targeting the radars first?
Absolutely. Radar systems are the eyes of any air defense network. Without them, those million-dollar interceptors are blind.
Okay, makes sense.
If Iran can damage or destroy the early warning radar arrays, they drastically reduce the warning time the U.S. and Israel have to detect incoming, heavier ballistic missiles. By targeting the sensory organs of the military presence, Iran is trying to create windows of vulnerability in the airspace.
And blinding the defense system seems to be creating massive chaos on the battlefield. The fog of war is leading to catastrophic mistakes. I saw a segment detailing a friendly fire incident in the Gulf that sounded like an absolute nightmare scenario.
You are referring to the incident involving Kuwaiti air defenses.
Yes. The report stated that Kuwaiti forces who host U.S. personnel mistakenly shot down 3 U.S. F-15 fighter jets. How does something like that happen with modern friend or foe identification systems?
It highlights the immense, almost unimaginable pressure these air defense crews are under. When you have an airspace that is suddenly saturated with dozens of incoming suicide drones, ballistic missiles, electronic warfare jamming signals, and friendly fighter jets scrambling to intercept, the radar screens become chaotic.
Total sensory overload.
Crews are operating on high alert, deeply sleep-deprived, and they have mere seconds to make life or death decisions. In that environment, tragic errors occur.
And the human cost to the U.S. military is becoming a major point of contention in these analyses. Officially, the Pentagon has acknowledged 7 dead service members so far. But the tone of the experts we listen to suggests a deep skepticism about that number.
There is a strong consensus among independent analysts that the number of casualties, particularly the wounded, is being deeply suppressed.
How can they cope?
The logistics of medical evacuations often tell the true story of a conflict, regardless of official press releases.
Right. One of the videos highlighted the flight tracking data of military medical transport planes heading to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany.
Landstuhl acts as the primary receiving facility for wounded American personnel evacuated from the Middle East. The flight data suggests a volume of medical transports that far exceeds what you would expect for a handful of casualties.
So the flights don't match the official story.
Exactly. It's a classic wartime strategy to minimize reported casualties to maintain domestic morale and political support, but you cannot hide the logistics of mass casualty care.
Add to this the fact that Israel isn't just fighting Iran. They are fighting a brutal, multi-front war of attrition.
Their forces are stretched to the absolute limit. They've launched a massive ground invasion into southern Lebanon to combat Hezbollah, engaging in intense, close-quarters combat in mountainous terrain.
Right.
Simultaneously, they are heavily bombing Beirut. They are dealing with incoming drone and missile fire from Houthi forces in Yemen, militia groups in Iraq, and now direct ballistic missile exchanges with Iran. It is a logistical and military nightmare for the IDF.
I want to pull the lens back a bit and look at the actual geography of this war, specifically the Gulf states, because they are caught directly in the crossfire here. When we talk about the U.S. fighting in the Middle East, the American military bases aren't just floating in the sky. They are hosted by sovereign Arab nations.
We can call this the hostage geography of the region. The United States maintains a massive footprint across Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. These bases house everything from naval fleets to strategic bomber wings.
And Iran has made their stance on these host nations incredibly clear.
Very clear. Iran's stated policy, which they have reiterated through official channels and back-channel warnings, is that any country allowing its territory, its airspace, or its territorial waters to be used for attacks against Iran immediately becomes a legitimate military target.
And they aren't bluffing. They are actively hammering these U.S. bases situated within the Gulf monarchies. What is the ultimate goal there? Are they trying to conquer these countries?
No, the goal is leverage. The strategic objective is to apply unbearable geopolitical and domestic pressure on the Gulf monarchies. Iran wants to make the cost of hosting the American military so destructively high that the leaders of these nations are forced to evict the U.S. forces just to ensure their own political and economic survival.
And the escalation is moving beyond just targeting military airstrips. They are hitting vital civilian lifelines. There was a tit-for-tat escalation detailed in the reports that is genuinely terrifying if you understand the geography.
You were talking about the desalination plant.
Yes. The sequence of events was that desalination plants in southern Iran were hit by Western strikes. And within hours, Iran retaliated by striking desalination plants in Bahrain and the UAE. For someone who doesn't live in a desert, explain why hitting a water facility is an existential threat.
Because water is literally survival, and these countries do not have rivers or massive freshwater aquifers to fall back on. Nations like the UAE and Bahrain rely almost entirely on highly complex, incredibly energy-intensive reverse osmosis desalination plants to convert seawater into drinking water.
So if you take out the plant, you don't just lose water pressure, you lose the ability to keep millions of people alive.
Exactly. Hitting those plants is an existential threat to the civilian population of the Gulf states. You can survive a power outage, but a city of millions cannot survive more than a few days without fresh water in a desert climate. It is a terrifying escalation that exposes the extreme fragility of these modern, hyper-developed Gulf cities.
That fragility is showing up in the food supply, too.
Oh.
One of the economic analysts we sourced noted that Dubai is currently sitting on just 10 to 12 days of food reserves. How does a global hub like Dubai run out of food in less than 2 weeks?
Because Dubai is essentially a monument to global luxury capitalism. It's an indoor ski resort built in the desert. It produces very little of its own sustenance. It relies entirely on a continuous, uninterrupted flow of massive cargo ships carrying fresh produce, meat, and essential goods through the Strait of Hormuz.
And the Strait of Hormuz is essentially a war zone right now.
It is heavily contested and reportedly heavily mined by Iranian fast attack craft.
Yeah.
As a result, the global maritime insurance market entities like Lloyd's of London have essentially pulled coverage or jacked up premiums to impossible levels.
So the ships just won't go there.
Commercial shipping companies are flat out refusing to send their vessels into an active shooting war. When you cut off the maritime supply lines, that luxury facade of Dubai and Doha crumbles very, very quickly. You cannot eat luxury real estate.
So the leaders of these monarchies are walking an impossible diplomatic tightrope. I can imagine the tension inside those palaces right now. The Arab street, the general population, is already furious about the broader regional conflict and the humanitarian toll in places like Lebanon and Gaza. And now the leaders are trapped between their long-standing security agreements with the U.S. and the very real threat of Iranian missiles shutting down their cities.
It's a lose-lose scenario for them. The analysis suggests a fracture in how they're handling it. Some countries, reportedly the UAE and Bahrain, are leaning heavily into their cooperation with the U.S. and Israel, desperately hoping for a quick, decisive Western victory to remove the Iranian threat forever.
But a quick victory isn't happening.
Exactly, which is why others in the region are desperately seeking an off-ramp. They realize their entire economic models, built on global tourism, international finance, and seamless trade, cannot survive a sustained regional war of attrition.
They need it to end.
They are practically begging for a diplomatic solution, utilizing back channels in Oman and elsewhere, but they are finding themselves largely ignored by the primary combatants in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran.
Let's book this all the way home. Let's talk directly to you, the listener sitting in your car or your living room right now. We posed a question at the start of this deep dive. Why does a conflict 6,000 miles away, fought over radar stations in the desert, matter to an average Western citizen? The answer is the economic shockwave that is hitting your wallet today.
The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the single biggest economic trigger mechanism in this entire conflict. It is the choke point of the global economy.
The analysts stated that roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through that narrow strait every single day.
20 million barrels. That is roughly 20% of the world's total daily oil consumption. And because of the mining and the missile strikes, that supply is effectively gone. It is suddenly missing from the global market.
And the commodities markets reacted exactly as the panic models predicted. The day the conflict broke out, oil shattered the $100 a barrel mark almost immediately. And as we sit here on day 12, it's hovering around $115 to $120.
And the futures forecasts we reviewed and the financial analysis are warning it could reach $200 a barrel if this stalemate drags on into the summer.
Which brings us back to that $8 gallon of gas you might have seen today. But I want to dig deeper into this, because it's not just about the annoyance of paying double to commute to work. It's about a cascading crisis across the entire economy. Help me connect the dots between crude oil prices and the cost of buying groceries at Walmart.
It comes down to the lifeblood of global logistics. Diesel fuel. When the price of unrefined crude oil doubles, the price of the diesel fuel refined from it skyrockets proportionately. Our entire modern economy, the physical movement of every single item you purchase, runs on diesel.
So the cargo ships, the freight trains, the 18-wheeler trucks.
All of them.
Really?
When the cost to fill an 18-wheeler doubles, the trucking companies cannot absorb that loss. They pass that cost on to the retailers. So the cost of trucking a load of tomatoes to your local grocery store or a shipment of antibiotics to your pharmacy surges overnight.
And it impacts the farming of those tomatoes before they even get on the truck, doesn't it?
Immensely. Petroleum and natural gas are key ingredients in modern agriculture. Fertilizer prices are intrinsically linked to energy prices. When oil surges, fertilizer costs surge. That directly affects the operating margins of farms globally, which directly increases the baseline cost of food production.
So we're looking at a recipe for massive, sudden, unavoidable inflation across every sector of the economy. This feels like a massive political betrayal. The initial rhetoric from leaders like Donald Trump promised a short, painless war, an operation that would be surgical and over in a matter of days. That promise has completely evaporated.
It was a political promise detached from geopolitical reality. This is the hard truth of global interconnectivity. You cannot decouple a massive kinetic war in the energy heartland of the planet from the wallets of everyday citizens globally.
We're paying for it.
The Western consumer is essentially being drafted to foot the bill for an open-ended regional war through hyperinflation. And the longer this attrition lasts, the more severe the global economic contraction will be. We are looking at the potential for a severe global recession triggered entirely by energy shock.
I want to zoom out from the Middle East and look at the global chessboard. Because while the U.S. and Israel are doing the fighting, the other major superpowers are not just ignoring this. They are playing a very calculated, very dangerous game. Let's start with Europe. There was a lot of focus in the reports on the U.K. getting pulled directly into the crosshairs.
The situation for the United Kingdom is incredibly precarious and could be the tripwire for a much wider war. The British maintain sovereign military bases on the island of Cyprus, specifically the Akrotiri Air Base.
And according to the flight tracking data and military analysis, those British bases are being used to support the war effort.
Yes. They are being utilized heavily for U.S. and allied logistics, massive intelligence-gathering flights over the eastern Mediterranean, and reportedly as staging grounds for specialized operations.
Because the UK is actively facilitating the war from their sovereign territory, Iran and their allied militia groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon have begun targeting those British bases in Cyprus with loitering drones and missiles. Which brings up a term that I've seen thrown around a lot. NATO Article 5. If a British sovereign base is hit and British personnel are killed, does that legally trigger Article 5? Are we looking at the entirety of Europe being formally pulled into a direct shooting war with Iran?
That is the absolute nightmare scenario that European diplomats have been dreading since day one. For context, NATO Article 5 is the mutual defense clause established after World War II. It states that an armed attack against one NATO member is considered an attack against all members.
It's only been invoked once, right?
Correct, by the U.S. after 9/11.
So if the UK invokes it over Cyprus, every European nation is obligated to go to war.
Theoretically, yes. But practically, it forces a devastating choice on European capitals. Do nations like Germany, France, or Spain fully commit their militaries to a devastating Middle Eastern war that they didn't start, largely didn't want, and actively try to prevent through diplomacy?
Or they refuse.
Or they refuse to support the U.S. and the U.K., thereby completely fracturing the Western alliance and effectively rendering NATO a dead letter.
It's a wedge issue that could tear Europe apart. Meanwhile, as the West struggles with this, I find the silence from the Eastern superpowers deafening. Where are Russia and China in all this? You don't see Russian Sukhoi jets bombing Tel Aviv, and you don't see Chinese destroyers entering the Persian Gulf to defend Iran.
What you are observing is the incredibly disciplined, strategic patience of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They are playing a long generational game. While they aren't dropping bombs or committing their own troops, the intelligence analysts strongly suspect. And the situational awareness of the precision strikes on the ground suggests that they are heavily involved behind the scenes.
Involved how?
By providing Iran with crucial, real-time intelligence, electronic warfare support, and highly accurate satellite targeting data.
Which would perfectly explain how Iranian ballistic missiles are so accurately bypassing defenses to hit specific radar installations and command centers. They are using Russian and Chinese eyes in the sky.
It is a highly probable scenario, but more importantly than supplying targeting data, Russia and China are executing a strategy of proxy attrition. They are simply standing back, supplying just enough technical support to keep Iran in the fight, and watching the United States drain its military resources, burn its financial capital, and severely damage its global diplomatic reputation.
It's a strategic bleed-out. They were letting the U.S. punch itself to exhaustion.
Exactly. For China, watching the U.S. get bogged down in a massive, unwinnable, multi-trillion-dollar war in the Middle East is a strategic gift of historical proportions. It forces the Pentagon to drain naval assets, fighter squadrons, and munitions away from the Pacific theater,
leaving Taiwan completely exposed.
Leaving Taiwan and the contested South China Sea infinitely more vulnerable to Chinese ambition.
And for Russia, it's the ultimate distraction.
It completely monopolizes Western attention. The funding, the 155-millimeter artillery shells, the Patriot missiles that were destined for Ukraine to fight the Russian invasion are now being rapidly consumed in the deserts of the Middle East. It relieves the immense strategic pressure on Moscow.
But the geopolitical shift goes even deeper than military strategy. It's about the entire framework of how the world operates. There's a quote highlighted in several of the analyses from a Russian official, Dmitry Peskov. He openly stated to the press that international law is dead. It sounded like gloating, but the analysts took it very seriously.
Because it is a stark, accurate reflection of how this conflict is acting as an accelerant, it is accelerating the end of the post-World War II, American-led, rules-based world order. When countries in the global South, nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, watch the U.S. and Israel act unilaterally, bypassing the UN and traditional diplomatic channels to wage a preemptive regional war, they conclude that the old rules no longer protect them.
And if the old system doesn't protect them, they look for a new system.
Which is why they are increasingly looking toward the BRICS alliance. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and its rapidly expanding list of new members.
I see the term BRICS de-dollarization a lot in financial circles. How does a war in the Middle East actually push countries to abandon the U.S. dollar?
It comes down to the weaponization of finance. The U.S. enforces its will globally, largely through economic sanctions, leveraging the fact that global trade, particularly oil, is conducted in U.S. dollars through the SWIFT banking system. But when these global South nations see the economic chaos unleashed by this conflict and the threat of U.S. sanctions hanging over anyone who trades with Iran, they view the dollar not as a safe haven, but as a liability.
So they build a workaround.
Exactly. They are actively accelerating alternative global financial infrastructure, like the Enbridge system, which allows countries to trade raw materials and oil using their own local currencies or digital currencies backed by gold, completely bypassing the U.S. dollar and Western banking oversight. This war is acting as the ultimate catalyst for a multipolar world where American economic hegemony is broken.
So if I'm tracking all of this correctly, the global political order is fracturing. The global economy is teetering on the edge of an inflation-driven recession, and the military attrition on the ground is bleeding both sides dry. Which brings us to the most pressing question. Where does this end? Let's talk about the escalation risks, because sitting here on day 12, it feels like all parties are walking blindfolded into a trap of their own hubris. Neither side is showing an inch of willingness to back down. The rhetoric from Washington is escalating, with some officials starting to float the idea of committing ground troops, while Iran is clearly digging in for a protracted war. Let's tackle the ground troops idea first. Why haven't we just rolled armored columns across the border?
Let's be very clear about the idea of a U.S. ground invasion of Iran. Militarily and logistically, it borders on the impossible. The analysts we reviewed were almost unanimous in this assessment. Iran is not Iraq in 2003.
Paint a picture of the geography for me, because I think a lot of people just picture a flat desert.
Geographically, Iran is a fortress. It is massive, larger than France, Germany, Spain, and the UK combined. And it is not flat. It is ringed by formidable, nearly impassable mountain ranges, like the Zagros Mountains to the west. It lacks the easily navigable river valleys that allowed heavy U.S. armor to quickly roll into Baghdad.
So an invasion force would be bottlenecked immediately.
It would be an absolute meat grinder. An invasion would require a troop mobilization and logistical supply chain that dwarfs anything the United States has attempted since World War II.
And Iran knows this.
Of course. The Iranian defense strategy is built entirely on the concept of defense in depth. They intend to draw invading forces deep into hostile, mountainous terrain, stretching their supply lines and bleeding them dry through relentless guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and asymmetric tactics. The casualty projections for a ground war are catastrophic.
So if a conventional ground victory is geographically and militarily impossible, and the current air war is resulting in a deeply costly, multi-billion-dollar stalemate, why is there no political off-ramp? Why can't the leaders just call a summit and negotiate a ceasefire?
Because of the domestic political survival of the specific leaders involved, they are trapped by their own political realities. Look at the United States. President Trump is facing immense domestic pressure. He has a looming midterm election cycle. He is dealing with an electorate that is absolutely furious over $8 gas and sudden inflation. Furthermore, the stock market is cratering due to the energy shock and uncertainty.
He campaigned on strength. He cannot afford the optics of flying to Geneva to negotiate a truce with an enemy he promised to crush in a week.
Exactly. A retreat or even a compromise would be viewed domestically as a humiliating defeat. And the situation is even more precarious for Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. He has staked his entire political career, his coalition government, and perhaps his personal freedom from domestic legal troubles on achieving a decisive historic victory that permanently removes the Iranian threat.
He needs a total win.
Both Trump and Netanyahu need a definitive, undeniable win to survive politically. But as we discussed earlier, Iran cannot and will not surrender unconditionally without facing what they perceive as national annihilation. So you have a situation where neither side can afford to lose, neither side has the conventional military capability to achieve a total victory, and the economic clock is ticking. You are locked in a devastating, high-stakes stalemate.
Which brings us to the ultimate danger. Now, I have to admit, when I was listening to the defense analysts discuss this part, my blood ran cold. It is the darkest fear raised in the entire stack of sources we reviewed.
Yes. It is the logical, terrifying conclusion of an unwinnable stalemate. If the U.S. and Israel run out of conventional interceptors, if the factories cannot produce Patriot and THAAD missiles fast enough and the magazines run completely dry, and if a ground war is logistically suicidal, but the political leaders absolutely refuse to accept defeat or a negotiated withdrawal.
Something has to give.
The terrifying risk is that a desperate leader might resort to a doctrine known as the Samson option.
I've heard that phrase whispered in historical contexts, but what does the Samson option actually mean in a modern military conflict?
The Samson option refers to an unacknowledged but widely theorized Israeli deterrence strategy. The name is drawn from the biblical figure Samson, who, when captured and blinded, pushed apart the pillars of a Philistine temple, bringing the roof down and killing himself along with all his enemies.
Taking the enemy down with you when all hope is lost.
Precisely. In military terms, it means the use of tactical or even strategic nuclear weapons as an absolute last resort. If the conventional defense fails, if the homeland is facing an overwhelming barrage of ballistic missiles that can no longer be intercepted, or if a hostile military is on the verge of overrunning the borders, the doctrine suggests utilizing the nuclear arsenal to force a sudden, catastrophic end to the conflict. It is designed to break the stalemate through absolute, unimaginable destruction.
The use of a nuclear weapon would change human history forever.
It would rewrite the global paradigm in an instant. And this is the razor-thin tightrope the world is currently walking on day 12. The longer this conventional war of attrition lasts, the more the conventional arsenals are depleted and the higher the political desperation rises. The risk grows exponentially each day that someone, backed into a corner with no off-ramps, reaches for the ultimate weapon.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. What began in the minds of some politicians as a targeted surgical military operation less than 2 weeks ago has completely violently morphed. It is now a sprawling, grinding, regional war of attrition. It is literally rewriting the global economy. It is draining Western military stockpiles at a rate no one anticipated or prepared for. And it is altering the geopolitical balance of power, pushing the global South away from the West, perhaps forever.
The cascading effects of these last 12 days, from the surging price of a loaf of bread in your local supermarket to the shifting naval alliances in the Pacific Ocean, are only just beginning to be felt. The shockwaves will be traveling through the system for years.
At the top of the show, we promise to leave you with a final provocative thought to chew on as you watch the news over the next few days. And based on all the intelligence and analysis we've waded through, here it is. We know the United States is actively burning through its most advanced defensive missiles. We know it is rapidly draining its treasury to sustain this fight. And we know it is locking the entirety of its strategic and political focus on the deserts of the Middle East. So, what happens if another global flashpoint erupts tomorrow morning? What if Beijing decides that this exact moment of American distraction and depletion is the perfect time to make a sudden, decisive move on Taiwan? Or what if there is a major, unexpected escalation from Russia in Eastern Europe? If the arsenal of democracy is running empty trying to shoot down $30,000 drones in the Gulf, who is left to respond to the next crisis? And more importantly, with what weapons?
It is the exact question that military planners in Washington, London, and across the West are undoubtedly losing sleep over tonight. The window of vulnerability has never been wider.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the realities of this conflict. Keep your eyes open, watch the markets, keep your critical thinking sharp as you listen to the narratives, and we will see you next time as the days ahead unfold.
It is Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, and what started as just a flicker of conflict in the Middle East has, in just over a week, turned into a global wildfire. We are looking at a full-blown crisis, and the fallout, well, it's already hitting home, and it doesn't matter where on the planet you live.
We are now on day 11. And, what's happening on the ground, the military strategies, even the reason for this war, it is all changing, and it is changing incredibly fast.
One military analyst put it in a way that it really hits home. What became as a war of choice for the US and Israel is now just a brutal, grinding slugfest. And for Iran, this has become a fight for pure survival. Simple as that.
And a huge reason for that fundamental shift? Well, there's a new face at the top in Iran, and his motivations are now deeply, deeply personal.
After the strike that killed his father, Iran's new supreme leader is his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. But look, this isn't just about him taking his father's place. This is a man whose entire world was basically destroyed in the first few days of this conflict.
Just try to wrap your head around the scale of this loss. In those initial strikes, he didn't just lose his father. He lost his mother, his wife, his son, his niece and nephew, his sister, and his brother-in-law. So for him, this isn't politics anymore. To many, he's now a leader, being driven by a profound personal need for revenge.
So the experts are all asking the same rhetorical question. After all of that, do you really think he's going to be the one looking for a peaceful way out of this? The chances of that are, let's be honest, slim to none. This has gone from personal to global.
And that thirst for revenge is actively shaping the battlefield. Right now, we are seeing two completely different ideas of how to fight a war, and they're clashing head-on. So you have to ask, what does winning even look like for each side at this point? Because the answers, they are worlds apart.
Okay, let's break this down. On one side, you have the US and Israel. They are waging what's being called a war of destruction. Their goal? To absolutely cripple Iran's economy and military for the next 20 years. They're hitting oil refineries, water plants, you name it, all in the hopes of toppling the regime. But Iran is playing a totally different game, a war of attrition. They're not trying to conquer territory. They just want to make this war so unbelievably expensive, so painful, so bloody for the US that it has no choice but to pack its bags and go home for good. And their main tactic is just overwhelming Western defenses with endless swarms of drones and missiles.
And here is where that Western strategy might be starting to crack. In just the first 3 days of this war, the US fired over 800 Patriot missiles. Get this, that is more than they produce in an entire year. They're now scrambling, trying to borrow missile defense systems from allies like South Korea. The well is clearly running dry.
It's like one analyst put it very bluntly. This war finishes when Iran says it's done. Their entire strategy is a bet that they can simply outlast their enemies.
But look, this is not just about missiles and tanks. The economic fallout from this is already hitting every single one of us right in the wallet.
All this fighting has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this is a tiny little strip of water, but it's a massive artery for the entire global economy. So what happens when that artery gets clamped shut? Well, it means that over a fifth of the world's daily oil supply, 21%, has just vanished, gone, practically overnight.
And you know what that means? The price of oil has just shot through the roof. It's already nearing $120 a barrel. It has doubled in just over a week.
And that means you are feeling it every single time you fill up your car. Before the war, gas in the US was under $3 a gallon. Now it's climbing fast, and every expert is saying this is only the beginning.
So yeah, this is not just about paying a little more for gas. Economists are now warning that this is the spark that could ignite a massive global recession, one that would hit the US, Europe, and especially Asia incredibly hard.
And that brings us to the biggest and, frankly, the most frightening question of all. Is the world as we know it about to fall apart? Some analysts believe we are watching a turning point in history. A long, bloody war could finally mark the end of American dominance in the Middle East, and that would leave a huge power vacuum. And guess who's benefiting? Russia is absolutely cashing in on these high oil prices. And China, which has been stockpiling oil for years, now holds a massive amount of leverage over a world that is suddenly starving for energy. And the absolute fear is that this fire is going to spread. It's a domino effect. First, the entire Middle East gets dragged into the war. Then countries like Japan and South Korea, who are desperate for oil, feel like they have to step in. And then comes the ultimate wild card, North Korea. Seeing the US is completely tied up, decides it's the perfect time to make a move on the South. One war could very, very easily become 3 or 4.
As one commentator put it, we are literally in the middle of total madness. The old rules of the game? They're gone. We are in uncharted and frankly terrifying waters. So this is where we are tonight.
On one side, you have a war of destruction that is chewing through military hardware that can't be easily replaced. On the other side, you have a war of attrition that is sending the entire global economy into a nosedive. Something's got to give. The only question is, what breaks first?